Today, I'm honored to have Dr. Cynthia Chambers here. Welcome, Cynthia.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You've had so many works on curriculum and education, but today I do have some questions about two articles that you wrote them in 2004 and 2008. The former, which is titled "Research That Matters: Finding a Path with Heart." It was published in Journal of the Canadian Association for Curriculum Studies, Volume 2, Number 1, in spring 2004, and focuses on autobiographical inquiry. And the second one, titled Where Are We? Finding Common Ground in a Curriculum of Place, and focuses on the importance of place, land in curriculum. um, it was also published in Journal of the Canadian Association for Curriculum Studies, Volume 6, Number 2, in 2008. I believe that as your other works, these two articles are amazing, and I really enjoyed reading them. So if you're ready, you can let us know that how these works contribute to the field of curriculum and education.
Mm. Well, let me begin by saying I'm not really the person to ask that question to. I don't know what they've contributed, and I really don't. I'm not. This is not false humility. I don't know what their contribution has been, but I can say something maybe about each one of them. And about the research that matters paper, I don't know what it's contributed, but I do know I've had a lot of graduate students come up to me over the years and say something about the paper. And I think that essay, was an invitation, most of all, for people to use their lives not as a topic of inquiry, not a thesis about my life, but as a site of the inquiry. And this distinction came from a professor of curriculum studies at the University of Victoria, Antoinette Oberg. And she made this distinction, that when you're doing this kind of work in curriculum, you are using your life as a site of inquiry, not a topic, right? Also, it's kind of a manifesto about how important this kind of work is for becoming fully human in the complicated world that we live in, right? So it was an invitation, a manifesto, but as it unfolds, we begin to see it's also a cautionary tale about the difficulty of doing this kind of work in institutions like universities or schools, so it's a cautionary tale about the vulnerability of students and the responsibility of professors and administrators and teachers to and for their students. Um, it's also a confession, right? Because it's about how I was willfully blind to my own responsibility to my own student who is so vulnerable. So I think that's sort of what's at work in the piece, the way I look at it, right? So there are no easy answers, right? So doing multi-site statistical analysis studies have their problems. Doing autoethnography has its problems and its difficulties. So we have to be careful about each of those things. Um, where are we is also it's a manifesto to paying attention to where we live and who we live with. And the intent of that paper was to invite, it's also an invitation, right? So to invite curriculum scholars to turn away from the questions why
Mhm.
and how towards the question of where. Like where are we? you know, and when are we living? So, and then when we turn to the question of where, that invites an entirely different model of curriculum than why,
Absolutely.
right? Yes. So I don't know what the contributions have been, but those were sort of what my intentions
Thank you. And
were.
Cynthia, in order to create something amazing, we all need to be inspired somehow.
Mm,
Is there
mm.
any book, is there any article, an author that has impacted your works as an emerging scholar in the field of curriculum and education?
Well, I'd like to mention three, even though you've only given me a minute. Number one is, I don't, and they're not in an order of which ones are more important, but since you've referenced a couple of times the writing itself and how you as a reader have been drawn into the writing, into the piece and into the content because of the writing, I want to mention a book by the late Carol Bly. And this is called Beyond the Writing Workshop, and she was a well-known creative nonfiction writer. So she wrote nonfiction. She wrote essays, you know, sort of journalism stuff, but it was she used the what you would use to write fiction, but she used it and applied it to nonfiction. Her point was that writing for the truth, writing as deeply as one can write, and saying what really needs to be said and what you really need to say without fear and with courage, um, that this is the most important work, and that it's spiritual work and it's psychological work. So she saw the fears, she identified the psychological impediments to actually telling the truth. And I find this very helpful when I'm working with students who are afraid. Like at the heart of their research is a story. It's a wound, it's a story, but they're often afraid to tell it. And so they tell another story instead. But you can tell as a reader that they're not telling the truth. They're not telling the real story that needs to be told. So that book has been very helpful in my teaching and in my own writing to help me to help. It's a guide, it's a mentor. It helps me try and tell the truth, um, kind of at, I want to say, at all costs, at the risk of sounding dramatic. The second book I want to mention is Hans Georg Gadamer's Truth and Method. So in that philosophical book, he disentangles truth from method. So in the university and in curriculum, we're very driven by method. Well, what's your methodology chapter? How are you going to do this study? And, you know, how do you know that it's going to be valid and reliable and all of these sorts of things, right? So we're driven by method, but Gadamer disentangled those two things, and you know, and so truth is something else, right? And so that's, I think, always been my work in curriculum, is to seek the truth, but not to see it as being attainable through a particular method or a way of doing things, right? That one has to search and keep searching for it, and we have to do this with kids in classrooms because they're they're acutely aware of what's truthful and what's not truthful, right? Yeah. So, and so are grad students. So that's the other thing I want to say about Gadamer in relation to your first question about what's the significance of this work,
Yeah.
is that Gadamer said, you know, the meaning of a text is above and beyond the wanting and doing of the author. So what I wanted to do and what I meant to do with any of my writing is not really that relevant. It's what that writing means today in 2021 to you and anybody else who's reading it.
Yeah.
You make the meaning of the text, not me, right? I made it in that time. And and the other thing, of course, that Gadamer did was he asked this, or he made this claim, I guess, that I think is helpful in curriculum, is that every text is the answer to a question. So, but your task, right, as the interpreter, as the scholar, is to try and identify the question that's at the heart of the text, right?
Right.
So that's very important. And the last but not least, and this particularly is related to Where Are We? Um, Timothy Ingold's book, The Perception of the Environment, which was published in 2000, when he was still working as an anthropologist with boreal hunters and gatherers. And so a lot of his work is based on indigenous knowledges that was gathered through anthropological and ethnographic work. But in that book, he sets up the contrast between the kind of genealogical model of knowledge that we work with in curriculum, with a relational model of knowing, which is much more in keeping with indigenous traditions and local practices. So that's been a very influential book for me. And he talks a lot in there about apprenticeship in these traditions. And I've tried to apply that a lot to both curriculum, and what we know and how we come to know it, but also in how we teach one another and how we learn. Two other people were very important in my formation as a scholar and as a human being. Antoinette Oberg guided me through my doctoral program at the University of Victoria, and she mentored me through those first very tough years in the academy, the ones where I was becoming a teacher, seeking tenure, and trying to rise upward through the professorial ranks, all the while becoming enlightened about the intricacies and difficulties of faculty politics. So Antoinette Oberg created and administered the Curriculum Studies program in the Faculty of Education at the University of Victoria. And it was under her mentorship that I became the first PhD student in curriculum studies at UVic. And in that process, Antoinette introduced me to Ted Aoki. She invited him to sit on my dissertation committee. And through that process, Ted became, the single greatest influence on my curriculum theory at that time. When I graduated, I ended up in the Faculty of Education at the University of Lethbridge. And it turns out that Ted Aoki, after leaving Edmonton, too, had lived and taught in Lethbridge for many years. Both of us were strangers in Blackfoot country, both of us trying to write, think, and teach our way home. Both of us were seeking better ways of being and becoming human. Ted retired to Vancouver, which is my hometown, and from there, from Vancouver, he became a long-distance mentor, writing me letters and sending me notes of encouragement, suggesting books to read. He offered ideas and support and lifelines to sanity in my early years of the professorship. In one letter, he asked me to go to the Marquis Hotel in Lethbridge and have a beer for him, to raise a glass, in the very place where, as a Japanese Canadian, he was refused service. Even though he was a teacher, as a matter of fact, the first Japanese teacher in the area, but he was still refused service. Sadly, I had to write Ted back to tell him that the Marquis Hotel was no longer standing, but I knew his story would always stand with me.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing these resources. And I think
Mm.
that they are really helpful for students who are doing their PhD or master in curriculum. And yeah, thank you so much for sharing them. In research that matters, finding a path with heart, you mentioned that as a Canadian curriculum scholar, I often use my own life as a site for inquiry.
Mm.
Would you please let us know what drove you to do work in curriculum and education?
Well, it began when I was very young and living in the Northwest Territories. And at that time, there was almost no local curriculum. So the curriculum was incredibly colonial, i.e., it came from the center. And so in the North, we lived in the margins, and our curriculum sort of came from the center. And, we had, we were reading Dick and Jane, who wore, their parents wore suits and dresses and high heels, and they had a dog named Spot and a cat named Puff. And we lived in small houses with no running water, and we lived in parkas and mucklucks. So we lived with a colonial curriculum that wasn't from, which perhaps you can identify with, or many of the students can identify with. And so growing up in active sites of colonialism was a very strong factor in my desire to work in the area of curriculum and curriculum studies, to sort of understand, what knowledge is of most worth, and how does it get there. And when I was living in Yellowknife in the Northwest Territories, there was very little local curriculum, but there was a movement to begin local curriculum. And so that's when I started this interest in what are locally situated practices of knowing, and what are the knowledges that are needed to live here. So, yeah, and that became the impetus that carried me sort of through my whole life, and when I went to graduate school, when I did my dissertation, and all the way through my teaching, I was very interested in getting students to see the local, and so through their own lives they could begin to see where it was they grew up, where their ideas came from, and what about that often needed to change. What did they need to understand, and what did they need to change? And how do we do this with children in schools? How do we get them to see that the knowledge that they are learning isn't coming, isn't sort of being dumped on them with a front end loader from some other place, but it's they're unearthing it in their location together, in relation with one another, and in relation with the place they live. There were many personal, well, yeah, maybe personal is not quite the right word. I mean, I come from a family of immigrants, nomads, people from Western Europe that had no real place. Once they got on the boat and came here, they didn't really belong anywhere. I went to 21 different schools from kindergarten to grade 12 in 4 provinces and an American state and 2 territories. I mean, I traveled relentlessly, and this was because my family traveled relentlessly we were always sort of from nowhere. And so that made this investigation of land and locality and home, this deep search for home in a place where it's very complicated to call it home, and marrying into a large Indigenous family when I was very young brought me right up against the questions of land and rights, and whose land is this, as Edward Chamberlain says, and this is another very important book: if this is your land, where are your stories?
Very beautiful.
And we didn't have stories about any of the places that we lived. And so I began this search for the stories of the people around me. And that was probably the thing that's been most influential in my work and curriculum, is particularly the Indigenous people that I've met along the way. My mother-in-law, Florence Erasmus, my a fellow that I worked and taught with, who's now gone on to the other world, in Narcissus Blood. These people were my teachers, and they were kind, they were forgiving, they were generous, and they taught me so much more than those books that I mentioned. I learned so much from the people that that I had these deep friendships with, and who were also, like me, interested in how we become more fully human with the people that we're with and in the places that we live.
Oh, what a beautiful story, Cynthia. Thank you. And so, in light of your experience as a researcher, where do you think that the field of curriculum is heading? And what might be some new directions of research?
Hmm. I don't know where the field is heading, um, but it seems that we need to pay attention to the need for wisdom versus what we've considered knowledge. That we need to recognize that in these times that we're in, um, it is our relationships with one another, with the past and the present, and with the other beings that we share these places with, that these are the things that are where we are going to learn, and that we must find ways to invite children
Yeah,
to pay attention and learn about these things, and both out of doors and indoors. We have That's our challenge. um, I took one of my young grandchildren to the museum here in Saskatoon, the Western Development Museum. And in there was an old schoolhouse with desks like the kind I had sat in in my colonial schools, in the many federal Indian day schools I attended. And he just said, "Oh, that looks like that video game. This is the video game." So it was sort of very interesting that his reference for anything new was not from this world, but from another one. And so our challenge is, how do we invite children and students to pay attention to what is in front of them here, and who they're actually with, and the skills of living in those relationships, mia wakota, when they say in Cree, the good relations with one another. This is what we need to pay attention to. Politically, we need, and curriculum has to attend to this, we have to pay attention to the question of land. And um, and we have to pay attention to the fact that we are, as it says in that essay, as the late Andy Blackwater said, our teepees are now tied down with the same pegs.
mhm,
So we are here together, all of us, these people from all the many countries you mentioned, and my people who came over after the after the drought in Ireland and the clearing of the highlands and whatnot. We are all here together, and curriculum has to pay attention to that.
yeah, everyone should know that where they are,
That's right.
Yeah,
And the history of that place.
yeah, absolutely. And
William Least Heat Moon wrote a book that was this thick. And I'm sorry, I wish I could remember the title, but what he did was a complete historical, geographical, botanical description of 1 square mile of land in Kansas,
wow,
right?
yeah,
Like, so, how do we look at this 1 square mile of land that we're on with the children or the people that we're teaching, and say, what's here? What languages are here? What else is here? Who else has lived here? Who's still living here? What stories are there about this place?
yes,
And what stories can we make together now? Because we're going to need those stories.
I do agree. Yeah,
I also want to mention in relation to this, Hosna, that what we learned from 2020, we probably should have known a long time ago, but it really came home in 2020, is how important it is going to be in curriculum and in education to pay attention to trauma.
mhm,
The trauma that people have experienced in their own countries, the trauma of war, the trauma of what's happened here that is still living in everybody's bodies, and the trauma of individual families, the trauma of children. And it's these are very important matters that we can no longer try and leave outside the classroom or give to the school counselor. You know, these are matters that we have to make part of the curriculum. So together we can better understand what these traumas are and how they're affecting all of us and how we can each help one another.
Yeah. And Cynthia, facing with the crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic,
Hmm.
what do you think might be the new direction of research on curriculum and education?
This is such a good question. And I was thinking about how the virus itself is works collectively. Like the viruses like talk to one another, they communicate with each other, and they change as the conditions change in order that they can survive. So I think we have some very important things to learn from this virus, right? They're working together, they're not all fighting with each other. They're working together as a collective to achieve this goal, which is survival. And so this is something we have to keep in mind, that we have to function a little bit more like the viruses. um, but of course, it's also that we don't know how to get our way. We don't know. There is no map for what we're in now. And the truth about maps is they're only useful when you've already been somewhere. They're not really helpful when you've never been anywhere. I mean, if you've ever been lost with a map, you know what I mean. And so Wade Davis's idea of wayfinding, and Ingold talks about the same thing of wayfinding, is what I think is absolutely going to be critical for curriculum as wayfinding. How do we find our way using the stories, the places, the memories, not specific locations, not something that's mapped out in advance, a priori, but instead we have to have the skills to learn as we go.
Yeah.
And this is what I think is going to be really important. And people are getting very angry at medical officials who said a year ago, oh, don't worry about masks, they don't mean anything. And now they're saying wear masks. And people are saying, well, you know, why don't they know? Well, they don't know. That's the point, you know, and there's a lot that we don't know. And so we're going to have to be careful with one another and learn together. And those are the skills that we're going to need, is to find our way collectively and to learn together. Rather than looking to authorities for the final answer or being angry that nobody knows. We have to find our way, and we have to help children find their way under these difficult circumstances. That's our responsibility.
You're right. And thank you so much for your thoughtful responses. And thank you so
Mhm.
much for accepting JCAC's invitation, and to stay warm and happy.
Thank you, Hasan. I really appreciate it. It was wonderful to talk to you. Very provocative. Thank you.